Hey, hope you're hanging in. We are getting close to the end of the course, only a few weeks left, if you can believe that. This week is a really typical week for us. We got a couple of thought primers to do, one due on Thursday, one due on Sunday. And I'm feeling jealous of you this week. I'm feeling that sense of jealousy that you might have experienced when someone you know gets to watch a really good TV show for the first time. I had that experience this last weekend with my brother-in-law, who's never seen Deadwood. And I just thought, oh, I would give anything to go back and watch that show again for the very first time. And that's the way I feel about the work that you have in front of you this week, because the question on the table for us is, does God exist? And you're going to read some really cool arguments and explore some really interesting ideas. And I think some of them will be new to you. And I'm hoping this is a really good experience for you. I've had students come to me years later and say, you know, that one argument, it really stuck with me. And I keep coming back to this one idea. It sort of nags at my brain a bit. And I'm hoping that you come across something this week in our explorations that you find valuable. One of the things I want you to notice as you're considering these various arguments this week is that, with the exception of a couple, almost all of them rely on the sheer force of logic to demonstrate that God is a logically necessary being or God is a logically impossible being. A couple of the arguments evaluate evidence, but most of them rely on the sheer force of logic. And I think that's worth noting because oftentimes, people who believe in God or religious people are criticized by non-believers as somehow being illogical or irrational. I think the philosophers that we're going to look at, who've been considering this question for thousands of years, are going to demonstrate that no, there are perfectly logical, rational approaches to this question. And for some of them, the logic is as sharp as a knife, and they're going to make these really compelling, interesting demonstrations, logical demonstrations, related to the existence or the non-existence of God. So maybe kind of keep that in mind as you're considering these arguments, what the kind of quality of them is. The other thing that I want you to keep in mind is the implications of the conclusions you come to, right? Because remember, the goal here is not to get you to come to one answer or another in response to this question, but for you to get clearer about what you think the important questions are, what you think some of the answers might be, and why some answers might be better than others. And it's just to clarify for yourself what your own worldview is shaping up like. And so if you come to a conclusion like, look, I've evaluated this and I don't think it's demonstrable that God exists, or I think it's demonstrable that God doesn't exist. Well, what are the implications to that? In other words, what then would follow by logical necessity from God's non-existence? One thing might be, well, what the heck is the point of anything if there's a point to nothing? If nothing has a point, then how does anything have a point or a purpose? On the other hand, if you think, an argument demonstrates that, oh my gosh, no, the existence of God is a logical necessity, God is the type of being that can't not exist, there are implications to that. Namely, well, this seems like a really important being to know something about, but how do I discover the attributes and features of this thing that I think exists by logical necessity and is the source of being itself? All right, so maybe think about those questions as you're exploring these ideas. I'm hoping you have some fun with this stuff. I think it's super interesting, and I hope you find it such as well. One thing I want to point out to you is you'll notice that right at the top of Thought Primer number 10, you'll see that I'm asking you to print out your Philosophic Inquiry number 2 prompt, and that's because, unsurprisingly, it has questions on it that you're going to be responding to in a couple of weeks, and those are the same questions that we're going to be exploring in our reading, in our lectures, over the course of the next couple of weeks. And so you want to know what those questions are that you're going to be asked to respond to so that you can be taking notes on a week-to-week basis and hopefully make life easier for yourself and do a better job on your philosophic inquiry than you would if you weren't tracking these ideas over these weeks. Last thing I want to point out to you is at the bottom of Thought Primer number 11, there's a debate on this question, does God exist, between Rabbi David Wallopy and the late, great Christopher Hitchens. And I'm asking, just watch 45 minutes of it or so. And the reason I want you to watch this is not just because it's super interesting, but because you couldn't find two people who are further apart in their responses to this question, does God exist, than these two people. And yet, as I think you'll see as you watch through their discussion, that they're able to have a perfectly collegial, productive discussion with one another. And it's just so refreshing to see that in our polarized environment today, where you can have such a question of such magnitude, right? Does God exist? And then have these two people who are absolutely on opposite sides of this question have a perfectly enjoyable evening together exploring the question. All right, that is it. Have a fantastic week. If anything comes up I can help with, as always, be sure to let me know.